He slapped a 16-year-old witness in open court so hard the sound snapped like a rifle shot, yet the boy never blinked. A single, steady voice cut through the stunned silence. "May I speak to my father?" And when a Supreme Court justice strode through the doors moments later, every badge, gavel, and whisper in that room realized justice itself had just taken the witness stand. Hi, everyone. Today we're diving into a story that will shake you because it doesn't begin with fireworks or fury. It starts with a calm, thoughtful teenager doing exactly what he was asked to do. And yet, in the space of one quiet moment, he was struck in front of everyone. Not for lashing out, not for shouting, but for raising a hand to sneeze. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Elijah Hartwell didn't think the day would be extraordinary. He was wearing his best white shirt, one he'd ironed 3 times the night before, not because it was wrinkled, but because he knew people would be watching. People would read his clothes, his posture, the look on his face. That's what his father always said. They judge you before you speak, so make every detail say something true. He was 16, a junior at Riverside High in Rochester, Minnesota. A quiet kid, debate team captain, honor roll, no history of trouble, no fights. Just a teenager with a low-voice, sharp mind and the kind of self-control adults praised in report cards. But today he was a witness, not in theory, not for a school project, for real. The court was holding a juvenile hearing over an incident that should have been handled by a principal and a few detentions. Elijah had been shoved twice in the school parking lot by Travis Norwood, quarterback, class favorite son of Martin Norwood, who owned half the HVAC businesses in town. Elijah didn't hit back. He walked away. And when the school reviewed the footage and recommended Travis be suspended, Martin made sure it became more than that. "My son's being targeted," he claimed. Reverse discrimination. Suddenly, this simple hallway shove turned into a court hearing with attorneys' media whispers and a boy in a suit standing beside a U.S. flag. Elijah's mother had passed when he was 9. Breast cancer. That loss carved a permanent silence into their home, but it didn't make it empty. His father, Justice Langston Hartwell, filled it with rhythm and presence. He never missed Friday dinners. He was at every parent-teacher conference, whether it meant flying in at midnight or zooming in from D.C. He didn't raise Elijah to shout. He raised him to endure. Loud doesn't mean right, he'd say. Stillness holds power too. That morning, the Hennepin County Courthouse buzzed with business as usual. Lawyers adjusting ties, clerks checking clipboards. But Elijah felt the air thicken as soon as he stepped through the metal detectors. He wasn't scared. He was prepared. But he knew. He knew that this wasn't really about a shove. It was about what people saw when they looked at him. And more importantly, what they didn't see. As he sat quietly in the hallway, he texted his father. "They're calling me in soon." The reply was simple, "I'm nearby. I trust you." The room was medium-sized, lined with light oak. Judge Meredith Granger presided from the bench. Mid-60s. Stern, fair. Known for calling out lawyers who tried to perform for the gallery. To her left stood the court officer Brent Callahan. Tall, square-jawed, shaved head. He'd been standing at the door when Elijah first walked in and had looked at him the way TSA sometimes does when they decide someone just looks off. Elijah kept his posture, straight hands folded. He didn't slouch, didn't fidget. He'd been taught, don't give them a reason to question your presence. Let them question their assumptions instead. The prosecutor, a wiry man in his 50s, named Gerald Nye, called Elijah to the stand. "Please state your name and age for the record." Elijah Alexander Hartwell, 16. "And can you tell the court what happened after school on March 22nd? Elijah spoke slowly. Not because he was nervous, but because he wanted to be understood. "I left debate practice. I was waiting in the parking lot for my father to pick me up. Travis Norwood and 2 of his friends approached me. He shoved me. I stepped back. He shoved me again. I told a staff member. It was reported." "Did you shove him back?" "No." "Did you insult him? Threaten him?" "No." As he spoke, Officer Callahan shifted behind him. Not overtly, but Elijah felt it. That coiled watchfulness. To some people, confidence in a black boy reads like challenge. Calm can look like defiance, and composure. That's sometimes treated as disrespect. The defense attorney, a polished man with slicked hair named Douglas Flint, took his turn. Elijah, you say you didn't provoke Travis, but isn't it true that you corrected him in front of others earlier that week? During class, yes. He misquoted a case. I corrected the citation. Did that cause tension? I don't know. I wasn't looking for tension. The attorney tried a few more questions, but Elijah didn't waver. He answered plainly. No attitude, no stumble. Eventually, the judge called for a 5-minute recess. Elijah stood from the witness box and walked back to his seat. That's when everything changed. He sneezed. Just a quiet, human sneeze. He raised his hand to cover his mouth just as he'd been taught since kindergarten. And in that exact second, Officer Brent Callahan stepped forward and slapped him. Hard. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a snapped branch in dead winter air. Quick, sharp, unmistakable. A gasp rippled from the back row, followed by the kind of silence that doesn't just sit in a room, it presses down on it. Papers froze mid-flip. Pens hovered inches from pads. Every set of eyes turned toward the front, and the only one not moving was Elijah Hartwell. He stood exactly where he had a moment earlier. Same straight posture, same calm hands, his cheek reddening, but his body still. Callahan's hand hung awkwardly near his side, as if even he didn't fully understand what it had just done. His mouth twitched, a flex of the jaw. No apology, no words, just the sinking realization that something irreversible had happened. Judge Granger's voice shattered the silence. Officer Callahan, what in God's name do you think you're doing? But Elijah didn't look at her. He didn't look at Callahan either. Instead, he turned his face slightly back toward the bench, eyes level and voice even. May I speak to my father? 5 words, not shouted, not snarled, delivered like a statement carved in stone. And that's when the courtroom cracked in half. Because those who knew, really knew, felt the name coming before it arrived. The clerk blinked. A juror leaned back like someone had just thrown ice water at their feet. The defense lawyer dropped his pen. And Callahan's eyes, once full of authority, began to widen because now he realized who he'd just touched. Elijah's voice didn't waver. Justice Langston Hartwell. The name landed like a gavel, not spoken for show, just fact. Absolute, unavoidable. Then came the buzz, a low vibration from the clerk's desk, the phone, and moments later, the courtroom doors opened. He didn't rush in. He didn't storm down the aisle or demand order. Justice Langston Hartwell walked like a man who'd already measured the room before he entered it. Gray at the temples, charcoal suit tailored to subtle perfection, posture like granite. His shoes made barely a sound on the tile, but every step shifted the air. He didn't look at the judge, or the lawyers, or the people craning their necks in the gallery. He looked only at his son, and Elijah's face, so steady, so unreadable, softened just a fraction. Not into relief, not into tears, but into something deeper. Recognition, as if his silence had been holding something back, and now it didn't have to. Judge Granger stood, even Callahan straight and stiff and pale, but the moment belonged to the man who now stood in the center of the room without raising his voice. I was informed there was an incident, Justice Hartwell said. The judge, fumbling slightly, cleared her throat. Justice Hartwell, this isn't standard protocol. Protocol, he said calmly, was broken the moment a court officer laid hands on a minor witness. The tension hit a new octave, one that wrapped itself around every bench and every breath. Hartwell turned, looked Callahan dead in the eye. You touched my son. Callahan's lips parted, but the words never formed. Just a whisper of something that sounded like misunderstood or maybe misread. Justice Hartwell didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't lean forward. You saw a 16-year-old boy raise his hand to sneeze and you struck him. In a courtroom, under judicial supervision, during a hearing. Callahan tried to speak again. I thought his posture looked. Hartwell tilted his head, slow and deliberate. His posture looked what officer assertive, focused, unlike what you expected. A hush returned, heavier now. The judge stepped in, voice low but firm. Officer Callahan, you are relieved of courtroom duty effective immediately. Surrender your badge to the bailiff. There will be a formal review by courthouse administration. Justice Hartwell nodded once. With respect, Your Honor, that review must be external. I will be filing a formal request through the Department of Justice before close of day. Judge Granger hesitated, but only briefly. Understood. Only then did Hartwell take a step back. Only then did Elijah blink. The courtroom had changed. Not the wood, not the walls, but the people inside them. They no longer saw Elijah as just a quiet black student who talked like an adult. They saw him now in full frame, a son, a witness, a young man who had been struck not for doing something wrong, but for not matching someone else's expectations. The silence stretched, the kind that makes people realize too late they've been part of something ugly. The prosecutor turned slowly, clearing his throat. Elijah, would you like a break? Elijah shook his head. No, sir. The judge adjusted her glasses. Mr. Hartwell, if you're willing, the court would hear the rest of your statement. Elijah looked up at her. I'm ready. He walked back to the stand. No swagger, no signs of trauma, but every step told the room that they had already heard the most important testimony of the day, and it hadn't come in words. It came in restraint, in silence, in stillness. Elijah sat down in the witness box again, hands resting gently in his lap. The same boy, the same white shirt. But now the room held him differently, not as an invisible figure placed in a seat, but as the center of gravity. A boy who had been struck in full view and didn't crumble. The judge gave a brief nod. You may continue, Mr. Hartwell. The prosecutor, Gerald Nye, stepped forward again, voice careful. Elijah, we understand what just happened was disturbing. If you need time, we can pause. No, Elijah replied, not harshly, just matter of fact. I'd like to finish. Nye nodded. Please tell us what happened in your own words in the parking lot that day. Elijah took a breath, not to steady himself, but to give the room a chance to listen better. I had just finished debate practice. It was about 4:10 p.m. I texted my dad to let him know I was outside. Travis Norwood and two of his friends walked over. He said something like, "You think you're too good for us?" I didn't answer. I didn't even look up. He shoved me in the shoulder. I stepped back. He did it again, harder. That's when Ms. Vasquez, the science teacher, ran over and told them to leave. Nye continued. And you didn't retaliate? No, sir. I kept my hands at my sides. Why? Elijah looked out over the room, not dramatically, just to meet the question where it lived. Because I knew it wouldn't be seen the same way. There it was. The line that didn't just land, it echoed. The courtroom didn't shift in body, but in temperature. That sentence opened a door. Nye's voice cracked slightly. What do you mean by that? Elijah shrugged just barely. If I had pushed back, it wouldn't have been seen as self-defense. Not by Travis, not by his friends, maybe not even by the school, maybe not by you. It would have changed everything. I've seen it happen before. The room was still, no notes being taken, no fidgeting, just air being breathed more quietly. On the defense side, Douglas Flint sat back, his legal pad untouched. His fingers tapped on the desk like he was counting time he couldn't control. Nye continued gently. Elijah, when did you report the incident? Immediately. I told Ms. Vasquez. She sent me to the assistant principal's office. I gave a written statement, and the school's investigation confirmed your account. Yes, they reviewed the footage. They saw the two shoves. They also saw I didn't touch Travis at any point. Nye nodded. No further questions. Judge Granger turned. Defense may cross. Flint stood slowly. He adjusted his tie, walked forward like he wasn't quite sure his shoes fit right. Elijah, you're an impressive young man. Elijah didn't reply. Flint offered a tight smile. You're well-spoken, measured, some might say, unusually composed for someone your age. Is that a question? Elijah asked. Flint blinked, caught off guard. No, just an observation. He looked at his notes but didn't seem to find what he needed. You mentioned you've seen this happen before. What did you mean by that? Elijah tilted his head slightly. I meant that when black students react, it's often called aggression. When white students react, it's usually called emotion. The judge didn't interrupt. The room didn't stir. No one objected. Flint tried to pivot. You don't think the school acted fairly? I think they tried. But Travis's father didn't want it to stay in the school. That's why we're here now. Flint opened his mouth again, then closed it. He stepped back. No further questions. Judge Granger leaned forward, voice level. Thank you, Elijah. You may step down. Elijah nodded, walked back to his seat next to the prosecutor. He didn't look at anyone directly, but the room followed every step. Then Judge Granger turned her gaze toward Justice Langston Hartwell, who had been seated silently in the front row. Justice Hartwell, she began carefully. I realize this hearing is not a federal matter, but given the circumstances, would you like to make a brief statement before we proceed? Justice Hartwell stood. Not rushed, not reluctant, just steady. Thank you, Your Honor. He didn't walk to the podium. He didn't need to. I am here today not as a justice of the United States Supreme Court, but as a father. My son was struck while testifying by an officer of this court. That is not simply misconduct. It is a violation of everything this room is supposed to represent. Callahan, now seated in the far corner with his head down, didn't move. I will not use my title to influence outcome, but I will use my voice to call for process. Public, transparent, accountable. Not because it's my son who was harmed, but because it could have been anyone's. And if it were anyone else's, I would hope someone would stand in the same place I stand now. He looked toward the judge. Thank you. And then he sat. Nothing more, nothing less. And somehow that quiet was louder than any argument. Judge Granger nodded. The court will recess for 30 minutes before delivering findings. As the room began to slowly exhale, Elijah remained seated, his father now beside him. No words passed between them, just a silent agreement. What needed to be said had been said, and now, people were listening. When the court reconvened, the gallery was fuller than before. Word had spread. What had started as a quiet juvenile hearing was now something else entirely. Reporters had slipped in quietly. A few students from Riverside High sat in the back with their parents. 2 local pastors were present. The room no longer felt like it belonged to process, it belonged to meaning. Judge Meredith Granger returned to the bench with her robe smoothed and her hands folded over a stack of papers. But before she spoke, she looked across the courtroom with a kind of settled seriousness. A look that said, what happens next will be remembered. Before I read my recommendations, she began, I want to make something very clear. This courtroom, like every court in this country, is meant to be a place where the vulnerable are protected, not punished, where words are heard before assumptions are made, where silence is not mistaken for guilt and calm is not mistaken for threat. She paused. And earlier today, that promise was broken. A murmur of agreement rose from the gallery. Subtle, but felt. I am formally recommending that Officer Brent Callahan be removed from all courtroom duties pending an external investigation by the Department of Justice. In addition, I am requesting a full review of his prior conduct and incident records over the last 5 years. There was no applause, but you could feel the shift again, a collective breath being let out, a wrong moment, beginning to be made right. Judge Granger continued. As for the harassment claim, after reviewing the testimony, surveillance footage, and multiple corroborating staff reports, this court finds Travis Norwood responsible for targeted physical intimidation. I am recommending a full academic suspension, behavioral intervention through an independent agency, and a permanent note on record regarding the incident. Martin Norwood, seated behind the defense table, shook his head slowly, less out of outrage than disbelief that his influence hadn't tipped the scales this time. Elijah didn't look back at him. Not once, because for the first time in weeks, he didn't have to carry the weight of being unheard. But that didn't mean the day was over. Outside the courtroom, reporters began to crowd the hallway, microphones in hand, cameras quietly rolling. Justice Hartwell was polite, brief. I came here as a father, he said, and I leave as a citizen who believes in this court's potential. Elijah, one reporter asked, do you have anything to say to others who might go through something like this? Elijah paused, and then answered with what would become the headline quote across multiple outlets. You don't have to be loud to be seen, just clear and still. He didn't linger. Later that evening, the courthouse released the surveillance video publicly after requests from several news agencies. It showed the slap, the stillness, the silence that followed. By midnight, the footage had over 1 million views online. The hashtags began to trend. He didn't flinch. Your justice for Elijah. The courtroom moment. But Elijah wasn't watching the numbers climb. He was home, sitting at the same oak kitchen table where he and his father had played chess since he was 9. The same table where homework got done, where dinner napkins were always folded, and where questions were always answered with honesty, even when they were hard. He hadn't spoken much on the drive back, just stared out the window, the collar of his white shirt still neatly pressed, even with a faint pink mark lingering on his cheekbone. His father set down a glass of water. You handled yourself, he said simply. Elijah nodded. I didn't want to be a symbol. You weren't, his father replied. You were a truth. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Elijah leaned forward. Dad, do you ever get tired of how much it takes just to be believed? Justice Hartwell looked at his son. Every day, he said. Elijah blinked slowly. But tired, his father added, isn't the same as done. And being exhausted by the fight doesn't mean the fight isn't worth it. The boy nodded again. But something was different in that nod. It wasn't agreement. It was understanding. The next morning, the school district issued a public statement. They announced new training protocols for all school resource officers, mandatory bias workshops for staff, and an open invitation for student-led roundtables about safety perception and race. Elijah didn't attend the first meeting. He needed rest. But the second one, he showed up, sat near the back, didn't speak, but everyone noticed him there. A few students walked over afterward, not to say anything groundbreaking. Just, hey, or sorry, I didn't get it before. And even a quiet, thank you. Not loud, but clear. At Riverside High, people started shifting the way they looked at things. A black student's silence wasn't read as cold anymore. A calm voice wasn't taken as arrogance. And maybe most important, when someone said, I didn't do anything wrong, people listened. Even if it wasn't shouted, even if it came from a seat at the back of the room, even if the only action taken was standing still. The days that followed moved both too fast and achingly slow, like a river thawing under spring sun. Local press briefings gave way to national morning shows replaying the footage of Officer Callahan's open palm strike, each host pausing on the freeze frame where Elijah remained motionless, eyes forward, the definition of unspoken endurance. Hashtags trended, op-eds blossomed, and cable pundits argued over whether the moment proved systemic bias or an isolated lapse. Yet for Elijah, the noise outside felt distant, muffled by the ordinary rhythm of homework, the hum of the dishwasher, and the soft creak of the hallway floorboards whenever his father paced late at night, reading briefs. At Riverside High, corridors, once filled with casual banter, now held hushed nods of acknowledgement. Teachers who used to praise his diction with a tinge of surprise now simply listened, and students who had never made eye contact offered small waves. Even Travis Norwood's closest friends carried themselves differently. Less swagger, more contemplation, as if they'd been forced to see a crack in armor they thought was unbreakable. 3 evenings after the ruling, Elijah and Justice Hartwell sat across from each other at the kitchen table with 2 slices of perfectly ordinary pepperoni pizza cooling on paper plates. No linen napkins tonight, just folded paper towels, as if ceremony might cloud the conversation. Outside, Minnesota's late April twilight stretched across the sky in watercolor blues, and the living room clock ticked in the slow counterpoint to traffic on the distant interstate. You know, his father began, voice low, when I wrote my first opinion on qualified immunity. I thought clarity alone could change conduct. He set down his slice untouched. But law on paper is nothing without the will to apply it fairly. Elijah let the thought settle like snow before speaking. Do you ever worry silence isn't enough? He asked, touching the faint bruise that had faded from crimson to pale amber. Justice Hartwell's gaze softened. Silence isn't the absence of action, he answered. It's the frame that makes the action visible. He slid an envelope across the table, an official letter from the Department of Justice, confirming an independent inquiry, not only into Callahan's record, but into broader courthouse procedures statewide. They're digging deeper, he said, because you didn't flinch. Elijah inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of possibilities. Travis, he heard, had begun his court-ordered counseling sessions. Students reported he sat in the back row, quieter than anyone had ever seen him. Ms. Vasquez emailed Elijah to say the school's new bias training committee wanted student voices his if he was willing. He wasn't sure yet, but the invitation itself felt like a small door propped open. A week later, the local community center filled beyond capacity for a town hall meeting on youth safety and law enforcement accountability. Folding chairs scraped linoleum as retirees, pastors, soccer moms, and teenagers packed themselves shoulder to shoulder. Reporters hovered near the exits, but the microphone belonged to residents. Elijah hadn't planned to speak. He sat near the back in a navy hoodie, hands clasped. Panelists offered statistics, parents recounted uneasy memories, and then a teenage girl from Elijah's chemistry class stood trembling, saying she felt invisible every time an adult interrupted her without listening first. Heads nodded. Someone called Elijah's name from the front, asking if he wanted the mic. A quiet churn rose in his stomach, the same churn he'd felt on the witness stand, but he walked forward, heartbeat loud in his ears. When he faced the room, the hush was immediate. He thought about debates about his mother's bedtime wisdom, about iron shirts and chessboards, and finally about that split-second decision to stay still. I didn't plan to become a lesson, he began, voice steady enough to carry, yet soft enough to force people to lean in. But if my silence taught anything, let it be that calm isn't compliance. Sometimes it's conviction, and conviction isn't measured by volume, it's measured by whether you stand in truth when someone tries to shove you out of it. The room remained silent for a beat longer than any applause could last. Then the city's police chief slowly rose and promised to implement body language de-escalation training for all courthouse and school officers, timelines, funding, and metrics on record. Commitments layered atop commitments, each tracing back to a slap that never should have been. That night back home, Elijah sat on his bed scrolling the Brown University application portal. In the personal statement box, he typed, then erased, then typed again. Stillness can be mistaken for absence, but it can also be the loudest argument in the room. He didn't submit yet. There was time. Downstairs, his father compiled notes for a keynote speech at an upcoming judicial ethics conference, each page opening with a reference to a single juvenile harassment hearing in Hennepin County. Across town, Officer Callahan prepared for his interview with federal investigators, left sleeve of his uniform still creased even though he no longer wore the badge. And somewhere in the city's patchwork of neighborhoods, a middle school boy watched the viral clip on his phone and for the first time pictured himself choosing restraint without feeling weak. The weight of what was witnessed did not lift with headlines or hashtags. It settled into daily choices, quiet revolutions in hallway conversations, revised policies, and the subtle shift of how one community defined courage. Elijah felt that weight every morning, but it wasn't a burden he feared. It was proof that presence matters, that one moment of composure can ripple outward, bending systems that once seemed immovable. And as spring edged toward the humid promise of a Midwest summer, he realized something his father had known all along. Justice isn't an echo of outrage. It's the resonance of dignity amplified every time someone refuses to be erased. The glare of headlines fades with time, but lessons linger long after the spotlights dim. So tonight, take a slow breath with me. Close your eyes if you can and remember Elijah's stillness in that courtroom, the way a single unbroken posture drew all noise to a halt. Let that image settle into the back of your mind like the final chord of a hymn. We live in a culture that prizes volume, yet quiet conviction can reroute history. If you ever feel unseen, consider the power in pausing and choosing your moment, in letting your dignity speak before your lips ever move. And if you're the one holding authority, wearing a badge, carrying a gavel, signing a paycheck, remember how fragile trust becomes when a hand rises quicker than a question. Justice isn't forged in shouting matches or viral clips. It's shaped in living rooms where conversations last long after the cameras stop, in classrooms where curiosity replaces suspicion, in city halls where promises become policies. Maybe tomorrow pick up the phone and check on someone who's been carrying weight in silence. Maybe step into a meeting and ask the quietest person what they think first. We mend systems by mending moments, one attentive breath at a time. So wherever you're listening, at the kitchen counter, with coffee cooling beside a newspaper, or on a late-night drive along an empty interstate, know that your presence, your witness, your refusal to look away matters. Keep that truth close. Let it steady your steps, and we'll keep walking this long road toward fairness together. Stay safe, stay attentive, and remember, sometimes the most profound way to stand up is to stand still.